guys can see okay? All right. So yeah, so first things first, we're going to design contact and address. So let me give you a little outline here. Contact is just going to have a name. It's also going to have an ID. Our IDs are always going to be longs. It's going to have a name, and it's going to have a reference to an address. And we're going to have an address class also, which is going to have an ID. Right, the reason why we have IDs is because we're dealing with databases. Everything is going to have a row ID in their respective database tables. City, state, and we'll make these all strings because it doesn't really matter. Zip, you could say that zip would be a short maybe, or an int, but just say it's a string. And this is going to be our domain model for now. I'm doing this address ID thing instead of just having contact contain an address. I'm doing this to actually keep it a little bit simpler with respect to the database logic. Right? We have two different tables, and I don't want you guys, since we're going to be writing raw JDBC code to start out with, I don't want you having to worry about all the joins and keeping things in sync and so on. So we'll just we'll have our application logic try to manage that instead. So contact is just going to have an ID that references an address. Okay. The other thing that you'll need to start out with, this is just sort of the sketch of the domain model, right? The other thing you'll need to start out with is an Eclipse project. So I have one for you, and this is why in the setup instructions I asked you guys to get some sort of a Git client if you wanted to, or you can always just download these via zip here from GitHub. GitHub always lets you just download a zip, so you can do that for now, or you can clone the repository. But the repository URL is here. Let me zoom in on this for you just to get you at the GitHub site. This is a basic Maven project, so you'll just download this and import it into your Eclipse or your Spring tool suite. So I'll give you a few minutes to get set up with that. Okay. Start my recording again. All right, so first thing we need to do, very simple, is just create a package to work in. So I'm going to be using, you guys can use whatever you like, but when you pull from Git, the thing that you'll see from my code is I use com.maracana.contacts. This is my project name. This is contact list. So com.maracana contacts, and we're going to create two classes. One class called contact, and another class called address. Right. So you're gonna have this structure under source main Java, and these are the things you're gonna fill in according to this outline. So let me.
Java project, right?
I'm sorry.
Create a Java project. Package. Com.maracana. Is that
this is just a package under the source folder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Create these two classes inside them?
And yeah, so just create address and contact, and these are the properties that contact and address ought to have. go. Drawn on my screen. We're recording it? Yes. All right. So, right. So contact. We said contact was going to have a private long ID and a private string name and a private long address ID, right? Yeah. Easy stuff. And easiest thing, did you guys do getters and setters? So Eclipse trick for some of you guys who haven't seen this before, maybe you can go to the source menu, and if you want to just create getters and setters for all your fields, you can do source, generate getters and setters, and this saves you a little bit of typing. I mean, you can type this all out yourself, right? It's just Java code. There's nothing magical here, but just to save a bit of time, because this is very repetitive, just do generate getters and setters. So I've got a get ID, set ID, get name, set name, get address ID, set address ID. Yeah. Okay. Cool so far? All right. Address, same deal, right? Private long ID. What else? Need a private string street, private string city, string state, zip. Thank you. Yep. Okay. And we'll do the same thing. We will source, generate getters and setters, select all, and format that. All right, no problem, right? This was the easy part. Okay. The part that's not necessarily so trivial is that we want to be able to save these things to a database, right? And load them from a database. So that means we need a database. So that's step one. We need a database. And I have taken the liberty of setting this up for you because it's just configuration stuff with Maven. So I just want to walk you through what I've done. This isn't necessarily the way that you'll configure your real production web apps. In fact, if you do configure your real production web apps this way, you're probably going to see some major scalability issues because this database is an in-memory database only. But it's good for class, and it's easy to work with here. If you look in the pom.xml file, pom.xml is our main. It's basically our build descriptor for Maven, right? It's like if you've used hands up who's used make before. You know, it was like make, yeah, GNU make or whatever. So it's like a make file, right? Or like an ant build file or whatever. Pom.xml is your build description. But it's a little bit more declarative, and it's also a little bit more convention driven. So for example, if you look, so actually the first thing when you click on pom.xml, you get this sort of wizard view. I almost never care about this. So just, I don't know if you can see this little tab right here. So this just gets you to the source. Okay. And let me maximize this. So this is an XML descriptor of what we're building. The first few things that we can see here is just some metadata about the name of the project, right? So I've called this common.maracana.training, right? Group ID is common.maracana, artifact ID is training. Why do you suppose, this is just kind of Maven intro, right? Why do you suppose we specify this stuff? Why do you think it matters that we actually have names for these things? I mean, because like when you're doing a make file, you don't put, sorry?
Class file issues, same file.
No, that's a good guess though.
Is it like a life cycle thing?
It relates to lifecycle in some way. Here's a hint. I can specify dependencies in a Maven build file. I can specify dependencies on other projects, right? So, for example, we know that our Java enterprise application is going to depend on the Java EE API. Well, that has a group ID and an artifact ID, right? If it didn't, we wouldn't be able to reference it.
Where does that artifact ID
Okay.
match up to? That's like
So
in the
it's
web.
like if someone else is using a
Yeah,
they can use it.
so right. If somebody else were using our thing that we're building, they would need to be able to reference it by name somehow, right? So we're declaring this javax.java EE API dependency, and likewise, yeah, somebody else could depend on this war that we're building, this web archive. What's a war, by the way? I'm sure some of you have seen this before. What's a war file?
Archive file.
Yeah. Okay.
It's
What?
nothing but a zip file. Which
Exactly.
Tomcat or whatever.
Yeah, it's nothing but a zip file. Yeah, a jar file or a war file, like they're just zip files that just have some extra metadata in a particular folder in them, right? Yeah, nothing too special. But the point is that we've told Maven that this POM is producing a WAR, a web archive, called comma arcana training, right? So that's what that's about. This is the version. Of course, we need to specify a version because people might be depending on different versions of our project. Okay. So here obviously it's very important that we're using the Java EE6 API.
We're supposed
right?
to use 7.
7 doesn't exist yet. So the Java 7 exists. Java EE7 doesn't.
Oh.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah. The Java Enterprise Edition stuff always lags behind by a year or so.
How does one know about these? Like.
Very good question. Okay. Actually, that's a good one to answer now. I'm always tempted to be like, I'll talk about that later, but no, actually, this is a good one to talk about now. If you go to maven.org, you'll see this wonderfully named site, the Central Repository. Sounds very authoritative. And I mean, as a matter of fact, it is pretty authoritative. This is where people generally upload their open source artifacts to. So, for example, if you wanted Java EE API, you would look here, and it turns out that there are many different publishers of things called Java EE API. We're using sort of the official one. But you can see that Glassfish publishes their own Java EE API. You'll see JBoss produces one, right? Apache's OpenEJB project, right? And I want to show you some other dependencies that we've got in our POM here as well. These are not in the regular dependencies block. These are actually under plugins. We have a dependency on HSQLDB. Has anybody heard of HSQL before, or HSQL?
Like a SQLite for Java.
Yeah, it's very similar to SQLite if you used that before. Yeah, it's an in-memory, very fast because it's in memory, a SQL database. It can persist itself to a file in the form of basically a bunch of SQL statements. So we'll actually be looking at that pretty frequently when we're starting to get into Hibernate, and when we're trying to debug as well. So we've got a dependency on this HSQL database, this particular version. We're going to be using a connection pool as well, something called BoneCP. We could do without it. It's not a big deal, but I like to throw it in there. As well as something that some of you might have seen before, the simple logging facade.
What's the difference between SLF4j and log4j?
I think SLF4j is a wrapper around log4j.
What does it do?
I
I mean,
which
what
one?
does it wrap? SLF4J.
Oh, it wraps the entire API because there were so many different logging frameworks. They they said, okay, we need a way of just providing a uniform API for like Java util logging,
Okay.
log4j, and there's like a couple more that I can't think of off the top of my head. So this just wraps that one, and it comes with a number of different provider implementations. So we're using specifically the simple provider, which I think just uses Java util logging. The reason they did that is so that my project can depend on the SLF4J API without needing to know which implementation is actually in use in the container that I'm running. Yeah, so
It's open source interoperator.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's all levels of abstraction upon levels of abstraction. It's sort of a mess, but the thing that's especially sort of a mess is these different versions. Like this isn't the latest version. But it is the latest version that the Jetty Maven plugin knows how to work with, so whatever. Okay, which brings me to my next point, which is that Maven is all pluggable, right? So, for example, basically, Maven doesn't know how to do anything by itself. Maven is a very, very thin shell. I said Maven is a build system, but it isn't even really. It has, if you want to build anything in Maven, you actually need a plugin to do it. You need the Maven compiler plugin. Okay. This is actually configured by default, but I needed to put a little bit of extra config in here as well. The important plugin for us is going to be the Jetty Maven plugin. What this is going to do for us is it'll let us do Maven Jetty run, just as one command. And that will launch our web application container, build all our sources, deploy the servlets into the container. And also, nice thing here is that I've set this up so that anytime we make a change in our Java, it'll recompile and those changes will be picked up by Jetty on the fly.
So do we need to install Jetty?
No. Yeah.
This Maven would do it.
Yeah. So basically, the first time we try to do this, and this is something I want you to do fairly soon, is actually do Maven Jetty run and just make sure that it works for you. If it doesn't, we're in trouble, because this is how we'll be doing all of our work. Okay. All right. So the point of all that is basically that we have the only dependencies that we can see from our source code. The only dependency that we can see from the source code is the Java EE APIs. We don't see any particular database implementation. We don't have that as a dependency in our scope. Rather, we've configured Jetty to provide a database and to provide a connection pool and to provide logging. So this is all container managed components. I want to make sure we have another course that we teach where we spend a bit more time going over sort of the like fundamental Java EE stuff. I want to make sure this is just familiar to you at a basic level. This idea of container managed components who hasn't heard of this before? Container managed components. So for example, the fact that Jetty is in charge of our database, Jetty is in charge of our connection pooling and so on, right? Is that so? Some of you haven't seen that before. All right. Who has seen this before? Very basic. Yeah. So what's the idea about all this? Why would you want that?
Security.
Security in which sense?
So the memory management and all of those things, as well as security, will be taken care of by the container, right?
Sort of a roundabout way of looking at it. Security. So security is possibly a component that might be managed by the container. And yeah, it's certainly better to let the container worry about it than to have to worry about it in your code. Why? So let me throw an idea out. This idea of abstraction. what does that make you think of if I say this is a way of abstracting something?
You don't need to worry about database connections and that stuff.
Well, we need to worry about getting database connections, but
Configuring it.
we don't need to worry about configuring it. Yeah. That's always the painful part, right?
Yeah.
Right. If we just let Jetty, just in one place, we say, okay, here is the way that we're setting this server up. Then we don't have to worry elsewhere in the code about making sure that we've got an HSQL particular, connection pool or whatever. And like I said, in the more sort of in the more basic version of this class, I go through this example of okay, so let's instantiate an HSQL. But then what happens if you want connection pooling? Well, then you have to configure connection pooling on top of that, and that's like more code. And it's a different API. You have to work with all these crazy different APIs. For us, we're just going to be using something called JNDI, the Java Naming and Directory something. Not sure what the I is. Is it just interface? JNDI. So basically, we'll look up our database, and the container will provide it to us. We'll say, hey, I need my training database, and Jetty will say, okay, here you go. So that's what our repositories are going to do. Our data access objects. They're going to have these JNDI lookup. Yeah.
So at what point it gets registered, this name of the database?
Yeah, good. So this happens, like I said, this is just sort of setup work that I did for you, and I don't want you to worry too much about it, but part of it is here in web.xml. Web.xml is your standard Java EE like place for doing just about everything. So over here I've declared, you can see I haven't declared much. I've only declared one thing here, which is just that we have a resource. A resource being something that has a name, right? This JDBC training DB, right? So we have a resource, and the implementation of it is specified here in this Jetty environment XML. Again, this is specific to Jetty. This is not the same configuration that you use for JBoss or Tomcat or whatever. It'll look slightly different.
So the web app directory doesn't exist here. Is that expected, or?
It should. If you don't have it, that's a problem. Do you have it?
Yeah.
You do. All right. Let me finish talking about this, and then I'll pause, and I'll come around and figure out what went wrong. Okay. So basically our Jetty configuration here just says, okay, we're gonna configure this web application context to contain a new JNDI resource called TrainingDB, and it's going to be implemented with a BoneCP data source. So this is our connection pool, and that's going to contain a connection to this HSQL JDBC data source, which is going to be on this URL and so on. So this is the clumsy part, right? You don't want to have to write Java code that deals with this, and you especially don't want to have to write it in multiple places. And I mean, probably the most important thing is that when you build your web archive, your WAR file, right? You wanted to be able to deploy that WAR file into any container. I don't want that WAR file to have any compile time runtime dependencies on BoneCP or HSQL or anything like that, right? I just want to be able to look up the name of the database, and that's it, right? So I want to be able to deploy my WAR into a Tomcat that has MySQL, right? So that's why doing this model is important, right? So like I said, the only thing that we can compile against, the only thing that we can write our code against is just the standard Java EE API. we're keeping ourselves very isolated from any configuration specifics. Okay.
The database comes with Jetty.
It doesn't come with. We actually declared that in the POM. We said in the POM here that inside the Jetty Maven plugin, we're going to pull in HSQL and we're going to pull in BoneCP and so on. Yeah.
Why do we have this log inside this Jetty? Why don't we have it on the project level?
This one?
Yeah.
Um,
Can't we use these logs in our code?
we can. That'd be totally reasonable. We'd specify this dependency here, and then we'd also specify a dependency up here for like SLF4J API. So again, this would be the implementation, and the one that we specify up here would be the interface. Yeah, so we could use logging. I was lazy and I didn't do it.
The implementations would go under the dependencies within plugins, and the interfaces are the ones that remain on the top.
Yeah, and this is sort of, we'll be playing with this a little bit, because when we get into Spring, it won't be the container that's managing things anymore. It's going to be Spring that's managing everything. So we'll change this some, but for now, yeah, I think it's a good practice to say the container. So in this case, Jetty, the container is gonna know about the specific database implementation and so on. Cool. All right. Let me do this. I was gonna say that we should start getting onto programming our repositories. But maybe instead, let's take a break. It's probably a good time for a break so that I can come around and make sure that you guys all have this stuff.
Okay.
Actually, sorry. First thing, just to see how much trouble we're in.
It's not there in the source directory.
It's just not there at all, right? So if you go into here, I'll cd into my source. Spring Hibernate. All right, so I'm here. I'm sorry? Well, what I want you guys to do actually is, so you can do this either from the command line or from within Eclipse. I'll do it from the command line first, so you can see it that way. I'll also show you in Eclipse after. Okay. What I want you to do is go to the top level of your source directory, where the the POM and the top level here. So basically, be in the same directory as your POM is, and do mvn. Here, let me make this a little bit bigger. Mvn jetty:/run. So this tells the Maven Jetty plugin to run, as you might expect, right? Mvn jetty run. And you guys are probably going to see a whole lot of downloading information. It'll probably be trying to download quite a lot of stuff. Eventually, this was very quick for me because of course I've done this before. But the first time it runs, it'll try to download things. Eventually, you should get to a point where it says started Jetty server, starting scanner at interval of 1 second. So I'm going to leave this up on the screen for a few minutes while I go around and check you guys out. All right, so it's 11:25 and everybody's disappeared, so we're going to take a break.